It started with an absence no one could explain. No announcement, no statement, just Princess Anne quietly stepping back from duties she had upheld with relentless precision for decades. But insiders whispered it wasn't exhaustion or age. It was something far more personal, something that began behind closed palace doors with Queen Camilla. And what unfolded in that private exchange may have changed everything. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. For years, Anne had been the embodiment of unwavering duty, a figure so consistent that even the smallest deviation from her routine sent ripples through palace corridors. So when scheduled appearances quietly vanished from official calendars, it did not go unnoticed. At first, it was subtle, an engagement here, a visit there reassigned without explanation. The palace labeled it as adjustments, a word so carefully chosen it only deepened the mystery. Because Anne was not known for adjustments. She was known for endurance, for showing up when others stepped back, for carrying the weight of expectation without hesitation. And that is what made her sudden withdrawal feel so deeply unsettling. Whispers began almost immediately. Staff who had worked closely with her for years noted a shift, something unspoken but impossible to ignore. The tension had been building, they said, particularly during recent joint appearances involving Camilla. Nothing overt, nothing that could be pointed to directly. But there were moments, brief exchanges, measured silences, glances that lingered just a second too long. In a world where every word is calculated and every gesture controlled, even the smallest crack can signal something far larger beneath the surface. And according to those watching closely, those cracks were becoming harder to conceal. Then came the reports of a private meeting, closed door, restricted access. The kind of meeting that doesn't appear on any official record but leaves behind a trail of unease. Anne and Camilla, alone, away from the carefully managed structure of public life. No aides present, no mediators, just two powerful figures, each representing a different force within the monarchy. What was said inside that room remains unknown, but what followed painted a picture no official statement could erase. Anne emerged from that meeting not with her usual composed certainty, but with a visible shift, something colder, more resolved. Those closest to the situation began to describe it in cautious terms. A disagreement, they said, but even that word felt insufficient. Because this was not about scheduling or minor protocol. It was, as some insiders hinted, deeply personal, rooted in principles, and in authority. In the very structure of how decisions were being made behind palace walls. And for someone like Anne, whose entire life had been built on discipline and loyalty, crossing that invisible line may have been something she simply could not ignore. The palace, of course, remained silent. No clarification, no denial, just carefully managed appearances and a growing absence that spoke louder than any statement ever could. And as days passed, the question shifted from curiosity to concern. Because this was not just about one royal stepping back, it was about why. And more importantly, what it meant for everything that followed. But what truly happened in that private meeting wasn't just a disagreement, it was the collision of two powerful forces within the monarchy. Long before this moment, tensions had been quietly building beneath the polished surface of royal unity. Princess Anne and Queen Camilla had always represented two very different visions of loyalty and of power. For decades, Anne had stood as the monarchy's quiet enforcer, a figure defined not by spectacle but by discipline. Her approach was simple, almost unyielding. Duty came first, always. There were no shortcuts, no soft compromises, no room for personal interpretation when it came to royal responsibility. Those who worked around her understood this instinctively. She was not the kind of figure who needed to raise her voice to command authority. Her consistency alone made her position unshakable. And that is what made her presence so formidable within the institution. She did not adapt to the system, she embodied it. But as the years passed, another force was steadily rising within those same palace walls. Camilla's influence did not arrive with the same rigid clarity. It moved differently, quietly, strategically, through relationships, through conversations, through a growing presence in decisions that once belonged elsewhere. Where Anne represented structure, Camilla represented navigation. And at first, those differences coexisted, held together by the unspoken understanding that the monarchy required both strength and subtlety to survive. But coexistence does not always mean alignment. Because beneath that carefully maintained balance, their priorities were never truly the same. Anne believed in preservation, in protecting the traditions exactly as they had been handed down, without dilution. Camilla, on the other hand, was seen by some insiders as someone willing to adapt, to shape the monarchy's image in ways that could resonate more broadly. It was not a direct conflict, not at first. It was quieter than that. A difference in tone, a difference in decision-making, a difference in what each believed the monarchy needed to endure. And over time, those differences began to surface in subtle but undeniable ways. There were moments small, almost insignificant on their own, where these contrasts became visible. Decisions about engagements that did not align. Shifts in public messaging that felt to some inconsistent with long-standing protocol. Reports began to circulate of disagreements, never confirmed, always softened by careful language. But even within those softened narratives, a pattern began to emerge. Anne, unwavering, holding her ground. Camilla, equally firm, defending a different path, neither stepping back, neither willing to concede entirely. Palace insiders would later describe their relationship in cautious terms. Cold but controlled, some said. Not hostile, not openly confrontational, but undeniably distant. A dynamic built not on trust, but on mutual awareness. Each understood the other's position. Each respected the boundaries, but respect, in this context, did not erase tension, it only contained it. And containment, as history often shows, does not last forever. Then came the shift. In recent months, their roles began to overlap more than ever before. Responsibilities that once remained clearly defined started to intersect. Decisions that once belonged to one side began to involve the other. And with that overlap came friction, quiet at first, then harder to ignore. Because when two figures with fundamentally different approaches are placed on the same path, conflict is not a possibility. It is an inevitability. And as that inevitability drew closer, the palace found itself holding its breath, aware that something was changing but unable to stop it. Because what had once been manageable differences were now becoming direct points of tension. And the longer they remained unresolved, the more fragile that carefully maintained balance became. But while those tensions simmered quietly for years, something shifted recently, and it pushed everything past the point of control. It wasn't supposed to escalate. What began as a routine internal discussion reportedly turned into one of the most intense confrontations the palace has seen in years. By the time Princess Anne stepped into that restricted office, the atmosphere was already carrying the weight of weeks, perhaps months of unspoken tension. Meetings like this were not unusual in structure, but they were rarely charged with this kind of underlying pressure. There were no observers, no mediators, no carefully scripted exchanges. Just Anne and Queen Camilla, facing each other in a setting designed for control, not conflict. And yet, according to those who later spoke in hushed tones, control was the one thing that slipped almost immediately. At first, the discussion followed its expected path, informal, measured, focused on internal matters tied to decision-making within the monarchy. But beneath that controlled surface, something was already shifting, because this was not simply about logistics or scheduling, it was about authority, about who had the right to influence certain decisions, and how far that influence could extend. And for Anne, whose entire identity within the institution had been built on clarity and structure, any ambiguity in that space was more than uncomfortable, it was unacceptable. Then came the moment when the tone changed. Staff nearby would later recall something they were not accustomed to hearing: raised voices. Not loud in the conventional sense, but sharp enough to break through the usual stillness that defines palace corridors. It was rare, almost unheard of, because in that world, disagreements are managed quietly, resolved behind layers of protocol and restraint. But this was different. This was something that could not be softened or redirected. It was direct, immediate, and impossible to ignore. The disagreement, as later described by insiders, centered on a recent decision, one that Anne reportedly believed crossed a line that should never have been approached. While details remained closely guarded, the implications were clear. This was not just about one action, it was about a pattern, a shift in how decisions were being made, and who was making them. Anne, unwavering as ever, is said to have challenged that shift directly, questioning not just the decision itself but the authority behind it. Camilla, however, did not retreat. Those familiar with the exchange suggest she stood her ground with equal firmness, defending her position without hesitation. This was not a one-sided confrontation. It was two forces, equally resolute, refusing to yield. And in that refusal, the conversation moved beyond disagreement into something far more defining: a clash of principles, of perspectives, of control. What followed was not resolution. It was rupture. The meeting did not conclude with compromise or careful reconciliation. It ended abruptly, the kind of ending that leaves more unanswered questions than it resolves. Anne walked out, not with the quiet composure she was known for, but with a visible sense of frustration that did not go unnoticed by those who caught even a glimpse of her in that moment. It was brief, controlled, but unmistakable, and perhaps that was the most revealing part of all, because Anne was not someone who displayed emotion easily, especially not within the walls of the institution she had served so relentlessly. For her to leave that room in such a state suggested something far deeper than a routine disagreement. It suggested a line had been crossed, one that could not simply be ignored or absorbed into the usual rhythm of royal life. In the hours that followed, the palace returned to its usual silence. No statements, no acknowledgement, just the familiar pattern of controlled stillness. But beneath that stillness, something had shifted in a way that could not be undone, because this was no longer about what had been said in that room. It was about what would come next. But the real shock wasn't the argument itself, it was what Anne did immediately after walking out. Within hours of that meeting, something shifted. Not publicly, but internally, the ripple effects were immediate and impossible to ignore. What made it so unsettling was not a dramatic announcement or a visible confrontation, but the quiet precision of what followed. Princess Anne did not issue statements, did not signal distress, did not attempt to explain. Instead, she acted. And those actions, subtle at first, carried a weight that those inside the palace immediately recognized. Engagements that had been confirmed were suddenly withdrawn from her schedule. Appearances that had been carefully planned were reassigned or quietly removed. It was not chaotic, it was controlled. And that control made it even more significant. Palace aides, accustomed to managing complex schedules, found themselves scrambling in a way that felt unfamiliar. Adjustments were part of the system, but this was different. The changes were happening too quickly, too decisively, and without the usual explanations that allowed the machine to keep moving smoothly. There was no room to prepare, no gradual transition, just a series of decisions that seemed to come one after another, each reinforcing the same reality: Anne was stepping back, and she was doing it on her own terms. For senior members of the royal circle, the speed of it all was perhaps the most jarring element. There had been no warning, no indication that things had reached this point. Even those who were aware of the tension between Anne and Queen Camilla had not anticipated such a decisive move, because Anne was not known for retreat. She was known for endurance, for facing challenges head-on without deviation. And yet here she was, not confronting the situation publicly, but withdrawing from it entirely. It was a response that did not fit the pattern they had come to rely on, that made it impossible to ignore. What deepened the mystery further was the absence of any formal explanation. The palace maintained its silence, offering only vague references to scheduling changes, carefully avoiding any acknowledgement of a deeper issue. But that silence did not contain the speculation, it amplified it. Because in a system where every movement is typically accounted for, the lack of clarity created space for questions to grow. And those questions began to move beyond internal discussions into the wider public sphere. It did not take long for the media to notice. Patterns began to emerge: events where Anne would normally be present now unfolding without her. Moments where her absence felt particularly striking, particularly out of place. And with each passing day, that absence became harder to dismiss as coincidence. It became a story in itself, one that no official narrative could fully control. Yet perhaps the most revealing insight came from those closest to the situation. Insiders, speaking cautiously, began to describe Anne's actions in terms that shifted the entire interpretation. This was not emotional, they suggested, not reactive. It was deliberate, a choice made with clarity, not impulse. And that distinction changed everything. Because if this was not a reaction to a single moment, then it was something far more calculated, a response to something deeper. Something that had been building long before that meeting ever took place. And that realization carried a quiet but undeniable weight, because deliberate decisions are rarely temporary. They signal intention, they signal resolve, and in this case, they hinted at something far more significant than a simple withdrawal from duty. They hinted at a line that had been drawn, even if no one had yet seen exactly where it lay. But while the public only saw a withdrawal behind palace walls, the consequences were just beginning to unfold. Inside the palace, the reaction was immediate and deeply divided. This wasn't just about one royal stepping back. It was about what it meant for the balance of power. What unfolded behind those guarded walls was not chaos, but something far more complex: fracture. The kind that does not erupt loudly but spreads quietly, forcing every individual within the system to choose where they stand. Senior aides, many of whom had spent years navigating the delicate machinery of royal operations, suddenly found themselves pulled in different directions. There was no unified response, no clear strategy. Instead, there were discussions, tense, measured, and often unresolved, about how to handle a situation that had no precedent. Because this was not simply a scheduling issue. It was a shift in structure, one that could not be managed with routine adjustments. Some within the inner circle reportedly pushed for containment, urging that the situation be handled with absolute discretion. The monarchy, after all, thrives on stability, and any sign of internal conflict carries consequences far beyond palace walls. But others saw the risk in silence. They understood that absence, especially one as significant as Princess Anne's, does not go unnoticed. And when it goes unexplained, it invites speculation that no amount of careful messaging can fully control. That divide between those who wanted to shield the situation and those who feared the cost of doing so only deepened the tension already taking hold. At the center of it all stood King Charles III, a figure now drawn into a situation he could not ignore. Reports suggest he was briefed quickly, the details delivered with the kind of caution reserved for matters that carry both personal and institutional weight. Yet his response, according to those familiar with the dynamics, was measured, almost restrained. Rather than intervening directly, he chose a cautious approach, one that allowed the situation to unfold without immediate confrontation. Some interpreted this as strategic patience, others saw it as hesitation. But either way, it left a space, one where uncertainty could grow. And in that space, interpretations began to take shape. Among insiders, a theory started to gain quiet traction. Anne's withdrawal, they suggested, was not simply a reaction to a single disagreement. It was a statement, with a silent protest, carefully executed without the need for public declaration. For someone known for her discipline and precision, such a move would not have been made lightly. It would have been considered, deliberate, and intended to send a message that words alone could not convey. And that possibility changed how every action that followed was understood. Meanwhile, the position of Queen Camilla appeared, at least on the surface, to strengthen. With Anne stepping back, certain responsibilities and influences naturally shifted. Decisions continued to be made, roles continued to evolve, and in the absence of one powerful figure, another inevitably occupied more space. But that shift did not come without resistance. Because influence gained under such circumstances is rarely uncontested. Beneath the surface, there were murmurs, subtle, controlled, but persistent, questioning not just the changes themselves, but the path that had led to them. Among royal staff and inner circles, the atmosphere grew increasingly strained. Conversations became more cautious, alignments more visible. It was no longer just about managing duty sit, it was about navigating a landscape where loyalties, perceptions, and unspoken tensions were beginning to shape the future in ways no one could fully predict. And as that landscape continued to shift, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer contained. It was evolving. And as the palace struggled to contain the fallout, one question lingered: was this temporary or the beginning of something much bigger? For decades, Princess Anne had been one of the monarchy's most consistent and reliable figures. So stepping back now wasn't just a personal decision, it was a statement. That statement carried weight because Anne's entire legacy had been built on something almost unshakable: presence. While others navigated public perception, shifting roles, and moments of uncertainty, she remained constant. Year after year, Engagement after engagement, she upheld a level of commitment that few could match. It was not about visibility or recognition. It was about endurance, a quiet, relentless dedication that became the backbone of the institution itself. And that is why her absence did not feel like a simple pause, it felt like a rupture. Within the operational rhythm of the monarchy, her role had always been more than symbolic. She was structure. She was reliability. When schedules tightened or pressures mounted, Anne was the one who filled the gaps without hesitation. So when she stepped back, those gaps did not disappear, they expanded. Responsibilities had to be redistributed. Appearances reassigned. The seamless flow that had long defined royal operations began to show subtle signs of strain. Not chaos, but imbalance. The kind that becomes more noticeable with each passing day. Outside the palace, the reaction was immediate, though not entirely clear. The public, accustomed to seeing Anne as a constant presence, began to question what had changed. There was confusion at first, followed by concern, because this was not a figure known for retreating. This was someone who had carried on through challenges without hesitation, and when someone like that steps back, it does not feel routine, it feels significant. Even without official confirmation, the absence itself became a message, one that people were trying to understand without being given the full story. The media, as expected, began to fill that silence with speculation. Patterns were analyzed, timelines examined, connections drawn between recent events and her sudden withdrawal. Each theory attempted to answer the same question: why now? Why would someone so deeply embedded in the fabric of royal duty choose this moment to step away? And while no single explanation could be confirmed, the intensity of the speculation only reinforced one thing. This was not being viewed as temporary. It was being treated as a turning point. That perception was echoed, in more cautious terms, by those within the inner circles. And insiders began to hint that this might not be a short-term adjustment, that the decision carried a level of finality that had not yet been fully acknowledged. And if that were true, then the implications extended far beyond immediate operations. It would mean a lasting shift, not just in roles, but in the balance that had quietly held the system together for years. Because Anne's presence had never just been about what she did, it was about what she represented. Stability, continuity, a link to a way of functioning that did not rely on adaptation but on preservation. And removing that presence, even temporarily, created a space that could not easily be filled. It changed the rhythm, the expectations, the unspoken structure that others had come to depend on. And as that realization settled in, the narrative began to shift once again. This was no longer just about absence or adjustment. It was about intention, about what her decision meant beyond the immediate moment. Because when someone so deeply rooted in duty steps away, it is rarely without purpose. It is rarely without direction. But if this was a statement, then the question became clear: who was it really directed at? What started as a private disagreement was now reshaping the internal dynamics of the royal family in ways few had anticipated. And in the absence of Princess Anne, a quiet but undeniable shift began to take hold, one that could not be easily measured but was deeply felt by those within the palace structure. Influence, much like space, does not remain empty for long. And as Anne stepped back, that space was gradually occupied, most notably by Queen Camilla, whose presence in key discussions and decisions appeared to grow with each passing day. It was not an abrupt takeover, not something officially declared, but rather a steady expansion, subtle, controlled, and increasingly difficult to overlook. For those observing closely, the change was not just about visibility, but about direction. Decisions that once carried a certain predictability now seemed to follow a slightly different rhythm. Priorities appeared to shift, not dramatically, but enough to raise questions among those familiar with how things had long been handled. And while the monarchy is built on continuity, even the smallest deviation can signal a deeper transformation, the kind that does not announce itself, but reveals itself over time. Other senior members of the royal family were also forced to adjust, stepping into roles that had not previously been theirs to carry. It was a quiet redistribution of responsibility, one that required careful navigation. Because filling a gap left by someone like Anne was not simply about taking on additional duty. It was about maintaining balance in a system that relied heavily on clearly defined roles. And as those roles began to overlap, the lines that once separated them became less distinct. Within the inner circles, insiders began to describe the emergence of what they cautiously referred to as a new balance. Not stable, not fully formed, but evolving, a structure that was still finding its shape, influenced by both necessity and circumstance. Yet beneath that evolving balance was an undercurrent of uncertainty. Because change, especially within an institution built on tradition, rarely comes without consequence. And while the system continued to function, there was a growing awareness that it was not functioning in quite the same way. Concerns about long-term unity began to surface, not publicly, but in the guarded conversations that take place behind closed doors. Because what had started as a disagreement between two individuals was now influencing the broader structure itself. It was no longer isolated. It was interconnected, affecting decisions, relationships, and the unspoken hierarchy that held everything together. And when that hierarchy begins to shift, even slightly, it creates questions about what comes next. At the same time, speculation continued to build about whether the underlying tensions had truly been resolved or simply pushed out of view. Because silence, while effective in maintaining outward stability, does not eliminate conflict, it conceals it. And concealed tensions have a way of resurfacing, often at moments when they can no longer be contained. That possibility lingered unspoken but understood, adding another layer of complexity to an already fragile situation. And through it all, Anne remained absent, not reacting, not responding, not offering any indication of what her next move might be. That absence, once seen as a temporary adjustment, was now being interpreted as something far more deliberate, a choice that continued to shape the narrative without a single word being spoken. But even as the power dynamics shifted, the silence from Anne remained on. That silence spoke louder than any statement ever could. No official explanation, no reconciliation, just silence and a growing sense that something fundamental has changed inside the monarchy. The absence of Princess Anne, once startling, had now settled into something far more unsettling: normalcy. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no shift, no indication that her withdrawal was temporary or even under review. Engagements continued without her. Ceremonies unfolded with carefully adjusted roles. The system adapted, as it always does, but the absence lingered like an unspoken question that refused to fade. Because this was not just about a missing presence, it was about what that absence represented and why it remained unaddressed. Inside the palace, the silence was deliberate, not accidental, not overlooked, maintained. Every opportunity to clarify the situation was met with the same careful restraint. No direct acknowledgement, no confirmation of conflict, just the steady continuation of official duties, as if nothing had changed, but everything had. And the more the palace avoided confronting that reality, the more visible it became. Because in an institution built on controlled narratives, silence is never empty. It is a message. And in this case, it was one that left far too much open to interpretation. Beyond those walls, curiosity had reached a level that could no longer be contained by speculation alone. The public, once patient, now searched for meaning in every detail, every absence, every shift in routine. Questions multiplied, each one leading to another, forming a narrative that no official voice had confirmed but none could fully dismiss. Because when clarity is withheld, imagination fills the gap, and what it creates is often far more powerful than the truth itself. Among those closest to the inner workings of the monarchy, the tone had shifted as well. And insiders, once cautious, now hinted more openly that this situation was far from resolved, that whatever had unfolded between Anne and Queen Camilla had not simply faded into the background. It remained unresolved, shaping decisions in ways that were not immediately visible but deeply influential. And if that were true, then what had been seen so far was not the conclusion, it was only the beginning. That possibility carried a quiet weight, because unresolved tensions do not remain dormant forever. They evolve, they resurface. Often at moments when they can no longer be contained within private conversations or controlled environments. And in a system as exposed as the monarchy, even the smallest fracture has the potential to expand into something far more significant, something that challenges not just individuals, but the structure itself. And that is where the deeper concern began to take hold. This was no longer just a story about disagreement or absence. It was about stability, about unity, about whether the balance that had defined the monarchy for so long could withstand this kind of silent disruption. Because while the institution continued to present a unified front, the questions surrounding it were becoming harder to ignore, not because of what had been revealed, but because of what had not. Through it all, Anne remained silent, no statements, no return, no visible sign of reconciliation, just a presence defined entirely by its absence. And in that absence, a narrative had taken shape, one built not on confirmed facts, but on patterns, on shifts, on the quiet understanding that something had changed in a way that could not easily be undone. Because sometimes, in the world of royalty, it's not what's said that changes everything, it's what's left unsaid. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.